Let's give the floor to Dr. Farsalinos from Onassis Heart Research Center, Greece, Department of Pharmacy, Patras University, Greece, National School of Public Health of Greece. The floor goes to him on the fusion of science and the role played by media. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for the invitation and for the very nice meeting. With New Zealand having 0.8% e-cigarette use among never smokers, I wonder why haven't they declared an epidemic of e-cigarette use in kids? Because recently the FDA declared this epidemic in kids. And if you look at the data from 2015, which was the latest data set available to the public, the proportion of never smoking kids who were using e-cigarettes daily was 0.2%. And the proportion of never smoking kids who were using e-cigarettes more than 20 of the past 30 days, in total, including daily use, was 0.3%. So New Zealand has about 3 to 4 times that rate, and they haven't declared an epidemic. So I will start with the WHO Ottawa Charter in 1986, which was about basically empowerment in public health, and it declared that people should have access to information and tools to improve their health status and to take control of matters that affect their own health. And why that is very important? Because we are seeing a lot of misinformation for a harm reduction theme. Now, where does the source of information for this and for other subjects related to health come from? I think the main core is the scientists and the healthcare professionals. So scientists are basically performing studies, research, which is published, and which is, while healthcare professionals are in contact with patients, and many of the patients smoke, and smoking is a reason for many of the diseases, so they also propagate the information to the patients. Now, the research is usually accompanied, and that's very common, especially for e-cigarette research, by press releases and press statements. And this, together with the patient communication, results in information propagation that affects the whole society and the perceptions of the society about a matter such as electronic cigarettes or tobacco harm reduction in general. And of course, the press releases are also informing scientists and healthcare professionals, because let me tell you that many of them are not really following the literature, they are following the media. You can see many times healthcare professionals expressing views which are basically copies of a headline in a newspaper or in an online news media, unfortunately. Now, one of the main sources for press releases in relation to research is Eureka Alert. Probably some scientists know it. Usually it's university press offices or the journals themselves that release statements about research, which are eventually being quoted by the media. The press releases are usually authored, but in any case always approved by the authors, the scientists who performed the study and wrote the paper. And of course, it is then released to the media. Now, what people read usually in the media about vaping, it's usually stories like this. Dangerous cancer-causing toxins, increased risk of stroke, cancer-causing benzene, flavored e-cigarettes are 250 times more toxic than recommended levels, stuff like that. That's common in the UK media, in Greek media, I'm sure in Spanish media too. And the result are these misperceptions about the relative risk of products like e-cigarettes compared to smoking. And this is a population study that we did in Greece. It was published a few months ago, and I'm sure the same case exists even in Spain. There are no data, but if you look at US data, UK data, you'll see the same. And you see that the right response, which is substantially less harmful, is a minority, basically. Yeah. The absolute safe is even less, but only 5.4% of the total population in Greece believes that e-cigarettes are substantially less harmful than smoking. But more importantly, if you look at smokers, it's even worse. It's 4.6% of smokers who believe that e-cigarettes are substantially less harmful. And smokers is the targeted population for products like e-cigarettes. So you understand why we're not seeing more use of these products among smokers. Now, I'm going to talk about something that Ricardo mentioned because it is very much into the Spanish context, and it's the case of lipoid pneumonia. This story started from a ridiculous case report publication in Chest, unfortunately, because Chest is a very reputable journal, which reported that while lipoid pneumonia is a very rare, of course, and inflammatory reaction of the lungs, basically it's pneumonia caused by inhalation of lipid substances, of a fat substance, yeah? And they said for this patient, the suspected source was exposure to glycerin-based oils. So glycerin, which is an oil. But there is one problem, and we have two chemists here who will explain very easily in its secondary school chemistry that glycerol is not a lipid. Glycerol is an alcohol, it's a polyol. It has two hydroxyl rings, and if you ask, maybe not a secondary, I think a secondary too, but at least a high school student, they will tell you that if you have a hydroxyl ring, then the substance is an alcohol, it's not a lipid. So it's basically impossible biologically for glycerol or glycerin, we have both terms, to cause lipoid pneumonia. But unfortunately, that was the only case, and even if we assume that it was not the case that Ricardo presented, that the patient already had the condition previously, but this false statement, which was propagated by health organizations in Spain, resulted in the reduction, almost to the point of elimination and extinction of e-cigarette use in Spain. And unfortunately, it hasn't been documented how many vapers who had successfully managed to quit smoking relapsed back to smoking because of these stories. Because Spain was one of the strongest markets for e-cigarettes until 2014, and it virtually disappeared after 2014. Now, one of the latest studies that generated a lot of publicity, and you probably saw it in the media in Spain too, it was available even in Greece, but everywhere else, is that e-cigarettes cause myocardial infarction, heart attacks. And as you can see, the headline of the press statement by the authors, and you see the source is University of California, San Francisco, risk of heart attacks is double for daily e-cigarette users. And another very important statement from the same press release, use of e-cigarettes every day can nearly double the odds of a heart attack. What does that mean? That means, and this is the conclusion from the study, that the increased risk that they mention clearly implies a causal link and also a temporal definition of events. When you are talking about a behavior increasing the risk of a condition, it means that you first do the behavior, so you first use an e-cigarette, and then you develop the condition, which is the heart attack. But the authors themselves, in the study text that no one is reading, especially not the journalists, mention that it is not known when the heart attacks occurred relative to e-cigarette use. And it is likely that some, I would say most, of the heart attacks reported occurred before e-cigarettes became widely available in the US. It doesn't matter when they were available, before or very close to the point that the people started using e-cigarettes. So basically, the nature of the study, and scientists know what a cross-sectional study is, and when you don't have any information about temporality, about which event preceded what, this conclusion and the accompanying press statements are false. But they were published in the journal, let alone in the press statement. This is completely false. And another reason further supporting this false statement is when you look at consistency of the findings. Now, imagine if we had 5 studies showing that, that tobacco cigarettes cause heart attacks, and 5 studies showing that it doesn't cause heart attack. I mean, that would be a confusion, that would be inconsistent, so you would be unable to generate any conclusion that tobacco cigarettes cause a heart attack. So what we did, but there is another note, which I forgot. You know, this study analyzed a survey performed in the US every year. But it's very interesting that they analyzed the 2014 combined with the 2016 survey. Now someone asks, why did you omit the 2015? Why didn't you examine 2014 and 15? Or 2015 and 16? Or all three of them? Why did you accidentally omit the year between? I suspect that the reason is what we did when we tested the newest and the most recently available surveys, that there is no link and no association between e-cigarette use, whether it's daily, some days or former. There is no statistically significant association between e-cigarette use and, in this case, coronary artery disease. So the finding is inconsistent. So besides the fact that the study is unable to provide a causal link, even the association, and the association means people who use e-cigarettes have had myocardial infarctions. We don't know if they had it before or after. Not that the use of e-cigarette is a risk factor for myocardial infarction. So we didn't find any association from the two latest studies that we have the data set available publicly. We are going to publish a study very soon. Now, another media story that generated a lot of publicity, and it's very important because you know that the vast majority of cigarette users are using flavored liquids. You can barely find anyone using only unflavored liquids, is two scientists from the US who found some crazy numbers of aldehydes, including formaldehyde and acetaldehyde, from e-cigarettes compared to, from flavored e-cigarettes compared to unflavored ones. To give you an idea, the difference in formaldehyde emissions between an unflavored and a flavored e-cigarette liquid was up to 10,000 times higher. So 4 orders of magnitude. So what we did was to replicate the study. So we used exactly the same liquids, the same atomizer, the same battery, the same power settings, the same puff duration. We took the 3 liquids that had the highest reported levels. And it's very interesting because we reported our results here for 2 variants, a standard version and the sweetened version, compared to the findings from the same liquids by the original researchers. And unlike the researchers who did their first ever study on e-cigarettes, we used a lab in the US which is ISO accredited for aerosol collection and measuring aldehydes in e-cigarette aerosols specifically. So these are the results from the same liquid, same battery, same power, same atomizer, compared to what the American researchers reported. Did you see anywhere in the media this replication study? I suppose you didn't, because no one was willing to cover that. The study is already published this year. And going to Charles, who was asking to do a comparison between candles or some other exposures, I don't know where is he, yeah. You don't need to compare it to any other type of behaviors. Compare it to what's the commonly measured indoor air, indoor I mean in your house, air levels of formaldehyde according to the WHO. And that's not the limit for good quality indoor level. That's what we commonly measure. The limit is higher. And when you stay at home for 24 hours and breathe the air without doing anything, and the average ventilation volume of a human is 20 cubic meters, you will expose to about 1,000 micrograms of formaldehyde per day. If you consume 5 milliliters of the liquid with the highest levels that we found of formaldehyde, you will get 3 times less than that. The same applies for acetaldehyde. Commonly measured indoor levels, the limit for good air quality set by the EU, and the e-cigarette, the worst e-cigarette of our study. And for acrolein, there are no limits for indoor, so we use the occupational exposure limit from NIOS, and that's the worst case e-cigarette. So no need to light any candles, no need to do any other kind of risky behaviors like cooking in your kitchen, just staying at home and breathing the air in your house, not even going to work, which can be a risky environment. No one reported these findings. This is a copy of the same graphs that were published in the journal, Food and Chemical Toxicology. Now, why do we see this level of misinformation and unbalanced information, which unfortunately prevails? Now, I think that there is a lot of prejudice in tobacco harm reduction research and in tobacco control research. It seems, and it's very obvious, especially in the US, that scientists are more willing to look for problems than for benefits. For example, you see among adolescents a lot of studies measuring a getaway from e-cigarette use to smoking. So they are assessing people who use, adolescents who use e-cigarettes at baseline and how they transition to smoking at follow-up. But you rarely see the opposite, looking at smokers at baseline and how they transition to vaping at follow-up. There is only one study which presented on the main text the first part, but on a supplementary material the second part, and they found exactly the same trends. And the latest study by Anne McNeil, who evaluated both trends. You see also some organizations who are funding research, and they are mainly focused on finding and looking for problems only. So it's natural that scientists are going to react by being motivated to look for problems, because that's what the research funding is asking for. And many scientists are pretty much dependent on this type of funding. There is also an abstinence-only ideology and approach, and a denial for harm reduction potential for smoking, although, first of all, this abstinence-only approach has not solved the smoking problem globally. We have 1 billion smokers all over the world. And harm reduction strategy has been accepted almost globally in many other areas, HIV, IV drugs, and so on. And of course, there's a lot of predisposition, even by scientists, that because the e-cigarette looks like smoking, because what you exhale looks like smoke, then it must be bad. Then the renormalization stories and so on, what I call usually the visual aspect. I think that we also see a phenomenon of the end justifying the means. And what do I mean by that? Public health community doesn't want people to use nicotine because they discuss about this dependence, addiction, or whatever. So they think of creating a message that will help their goal. So for example, you will see messages from the CDC and the FDA explaining that no tobacco products are safe, and that's it. That's the information that smokers get in the US. This information is perceived by most of them that everything is equally unsafe. But the message itself, which is not necessarily a lie, but it's half the truth, and usually half the truth is a lie, it does not provide any information on the degree of risks and the relative risks between different products. For example, oral smokeless tobacco products like snus versus smoking combustible cigarettes. And Lynn Kozlowski with Edwards published, even before the e-cigarettes, a critique, an ethical critique, basically, of this approach, discussing about the right to reliable, basically, health information that should be respected, irrespectively on whether the CDC or the FDA accepts or not a harm reduction policy and strategy. You can't lie because you have a specific strategy and you want people to consider your strategy as the correct one. You need to provide the truth. And that's why I'm repeating the WHO Ottawa Charter here. because we are seeing that people don't have access to reliable information for a public health matter like smoking. And they are deprived from the tools, and I'm talking about smokers, that help them promote their health when in some countries e-cigarettes are banned. When in a state in India a few days ago, the possession of e-cigarettes has been illegal and you are risking being jailed if you have an e-cigarette, let alone sell one. And what is very interesting in all the press media that I showed here, but it's just a small number of the whole example, is that you will never see in any of them the word smoking. So there is no comparison with smoking anywhere in all these statements. And in most of the studies, they didn't even include smoking as a comparator. But even in the press media, no one discusses about how these risks, if they exist, relate to continuous smoking. Because let's be honest, 95% of vapers, of adult vapers, are smokers, current or former smokers. The e-cigarette used by never smoking adults is almost everywhere 0.2%. 0.2% of never smokers, and I'm talking about adults, are current e-cigarette users. So it's basically zero. So all these media are mainly about smokers, current or former smokers, and you don't see the word smoking anywhere. So in conclusion, there is definitely a serious problem of one-sided and unbalanced information, which is basically misinformation, delivered to the population. The source, unfortunately, as I said, is the scientific community. It's not the journalists. The media just participate to this vicious cycle of misinformation because they like the bad stories. There are serious consequences. There are extensive misconceptions, especially among smokers. And of course, this is basically active discouragement from using these products as smoking alternatives. It's even worse than what we see in adolescents. And in my opinion, it's a violation of a basic human right that people deserve appropriate information so that they make informed decisions about their own health. And I'm talking mainly about smokers or non-smokers who want to start using something like a tobacco cigarette. And they will think it's the same as any cigarette. Thank you very much. Ricardo is not. I think you're next.
Thank you for this magnificent presentation. What can we do in order to fight all this?
Who is going to translate? What you can do? You can try to convince Bloomberg to invest some money on the tobacco harm reduction instead of investing money in killing tobacco harm reduction. Well, it's extremely hard because there is a big problem. The human brain is programmed to avoid harm, to avoid risks. So it is much easier for the public to believe a negative story discussing about risks, dangers, harms, than to believe a positive story. So by definition, people who want to show that e-cigarettes are not that bad and there are some benefits are having a hard time because of that. The second is that because of this instinct that humans have and because they like bad stories, the media prefer to report bad stories. So you will see, for example, very recently, everyone all over the world replicating the story about the macrophages, the alveolar macrophages, which are suppressed when you use cigarettes coming from England, the study. And if you ask the journalist what's the macrophage, he wouldn't even know what it is. But the report in the Science Committee of the Commons of the UK was not mentioned by any media, which said that the UK government should relax the restrictions on e-cigarettes, should increase marketing campaigns. No one reported that, which was a good story for e-cigarettes. And it would be much more relevant to report this science/political issue rather than a very specialized study on macrophages that has very limited, if any, clinical value and means basically nothing in a clinical context. But they don't. So also, I think that the tobacco harm reduction movement is having a general problem with lack of adequate access to the media. So my response is you need a lot of money, you need to invest a lot of time, and you need to have the tools like lobbies, like the harm reduction opponents are having in order to get access to the media. And it's going to be very hard because you are trying to convince people that something is good, and people are much easier to be convinced that something is bad. So you are in a disadvantaged position from the beginning. Yeah.
Que mi inglés no da para tanto. Vale. Él traduce.
We saw charts about the young people who have never smoked, and they start vaping. We also had graphs with a decrease in the number of teenagers who quit smoking. But my question is whether you also take into account the teenagers who start smoking now, because apparently no one cares about them starting to smoke, but starting to vape, or whether this number is going down. Since I think it's important to check how much they go down, as well as whether they start, whether so many start or not.
So I will have to agree with Linda's comments that we are seeing everywhere a rapid decline in smoking initiation in kids. That's everywhere. The US has historically low levels, and the trends have been accelerating in the reduction of smoking from the time that e-cigarettes became popular. And e-cigarettes can serve as an alternative. So instead of initiating with smoking, you initiate with e-cigarette use. Now, the getaway hypothesis, which says that people who start with e-cigarettes end up using cigarettes, the opposite is also true. People who start with, kids who start with smoking also use cigarettes because, and I will agree once again with Linda, there is a common liability theory and explanation that these kids are just willing to try things. And that's why you see that that kids who smoke and kids who use cigarettes are also more likely to use alcohol or to use marijuana and so on. Because they are just willing to engage in that type of activities and try things. But overall, if you look over the past few years, at the levels of smoking use and smoking initiation by kids, it's going down very rapidly. And nothing has changed since cigarettes became popular. In reality, if you look at the US after 2010, it seems that there is an acceleration in the smoking decline among adolescents. And it's now at very, very low levels. So we don't see any slowing, and Linda also showed data from their time series analysis that they did. It doesn't seem to be slowing the smoking decline, and it may also accelerate it. I don't see a problem, really.
Hello, Doctor. I'm Didio Silvestre from Portugal. I would like to ask you if you know a little bit about the taxation that is being charged at this moment in Portugal. We are paying something like €5 for an shot, just to give an example. I would like to have your opinion about, and what do you think about this kind of, how do you say, the kind of execution from the government, you know? I think Portugal is very.
I know. I was in Portugal 2 years ago.
Thank you.
And I visited the vape shop.
Okay.
And I was really sad by the phenomenon of the vape shop owner having to open the bottles and mix liquids with nicotine in front of the cashier in not really healthy conditions, because that's the only way of avoiding the cigarettes being sold at a ridiculously high price. And it seems that your government doesn't really care. So it's a non-sensible regulation. The amount of taxation implemented in Portugal is extremely high, and it makes vaping basically not accessible to the masses. So you had to create those tricks with concentrated nicotine, and you had to mix it after the vapor buys the product, which was a very sad, phenomenon in my eyes, and it's even against the EU principles of providing safe products and so on. I don't know why your government hasn't been convinced that the only result of this overtaxation is losing money and preventing people from switching. So you are losing on both sides, both in terms of the income for the government and in terms of public health. So it's a lose-lose combination. I don't know why they're not seeing that, or why they don't care about that. I don't know what the local industry or vapers associations have done in that aspect, but what we know is that price is one of the main motives for people to try e-cigarettes in an effort to quit smoking. And I think we should maintain this advantage of these products. These products should have a competitive advantage compared to smoking, and that includes accessibility, affordability, so price, restrictions, which should be substantially reduced, marketing promotion targeted to smokers, of course, but marketed promotion contrary to cigarettes, which should not be marketed. So all these are collection of decisions, regulatory decisions, that will make people understand that they need to try and make the switch. They're not doing that. So it's really sad. There's nothing more to say, but it's a very sad phenomenon which I experienced personally.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.